Thank you. Hello, my name is Raymond Shingoose. I'm the Executive Director for Yellow Thunderbird Lodge. We service 15 First Nations up in Treaty 4 in Saskatchewan. I'm also the President of the Caring Society of Canada as well too. I want to thank the people on this Treaty 7 and the Blackfoot Confederacy for allowing us to come here today. I just want to be short and sweet. This is the first time in my career, 40 years plus, along with my colleagues across Canada, this great country of ours, from east to west, north to south, that I've ever been in an opposing side honoring the spirit of the child and being that voice of the child. As a technician for our leadership for the last 40 years in what's right, what's wrong, and being respected as that expert in our region. I just wanted to really emphasize the importance of all the regional experts across this great country of ours who have experiential knowledge in child and family services, dealing with the federal government and the provincial governments, and also with the politics that we have to go through. So I'm just going to get right into my questions. I have more questions, and I have more weaknesses on the FSA than anything else. I guess the question I've been asking the AFN and Canada in regards to when did this process turn from a chiefs and assembly process to a party-driven process? We haven't got a clear answer on this. It totally excluded the National Advisory Committee, totally excluded the Expert Advisory Committee, the Institute for Fiscal Studies and Democracy, all these recommendations, and we did our homework, we did it well. The other thing I wanted to mention too was the questions that we ask is specific to our First Nations that we services. What were the compromises that the AFN made, and any of the risks it put forward for our First Nations that we provide services, and what this creates for First Nations? We didn't get a response. Second one was the FSA gives Canada and the AFN broad protection from liability, but only offers funding and insurance for our First Nations. Why are they more protected than First Nations? The FSA's tribunal process in there, to me, has less protection than the CHRT tribunal. Very cautious. And the AFN said today it's important to go back to First Nations lead-driven process. And how does this current proposed process achieve that with the Reform Implementation Committee? I have a lot of questions on that. When the largest number of these seats don't include Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, BC, Quebec, New Brunswick, and the list goes on for our regions. So it looks like this is a sweet deal for other than ourselves, specific to the deal that I've been reading. But this funding is based on the Indian registration system too as well. It's not a First Nations validated population counts. And this perpetuates the discrimination and continues the underfunding for all First Nations children. Got to stop that. These social transfer payments to provinces have a minimum of 3% annual escalator, while the FSA provides only an annual escalator of only 2%. This is clearly discrimination against First Nations and will result in a greater disparity in funding generation after generation, with First Nations receiving approximately 78 cents on the dollar compared to other Canadians in just one generation, and 68 cents on the dollar after 2 generations. Wow. First Nations with a low on-reserve population, less than 250, will encounter challenges despite nominal increases due to limited capacity to meet the actual cost of service delivery. First Nations representative services funding will have a minimum allotment of $75,000 for these First Nations, which will not cover the costs associated with delivering that service, given that First Nations also service their off-reserve membership. This is just not fair. Canada has a fiduciary responsibility to ensure funding fully addresses the structural drivers of child apprehension and prevention. Canada's child welfare system for First Nations is broken and grossly underfunded. The FSA fails to close that funding gap and fix the system. We knew that because we're the experts. The Dispute Resolution Tribunal cannot force Canada into compliance if Canada decides to limit future parliamentary appropriation, as the executive branch cannot bind Parliament. If Canada decides to cut a program component, a party, a claimant will need to submit a new CHRT complaint only if the courts as such. That's a legal thing. Agencies will lose funding due to prevention, IT, emergency, household supports, post-majority, and representative services funding being allocated directly to nations. ICFSD notes a potential loss of $20 billion to agencies across Canada over the duration of this agreement. You know what? I'm going to stop there. The list goes on. Very little strengths that we've seen in this FSA. I really encourage leadership, proxies, honor the spirit of the child through your regional experts, the ones that we have available to us on the ground. We're the experts here. I'm going to stop here. Miigwech.
Thank you very much, Miigwech. Proxy Raymond Shingoose talking for the Caring Society. And that ends our first panel on the overview of the draft agreement and political perspectives. And I want to, I thought you were speaking for the both of you. So, okay, so you can come to the podium then. Thank you. Proxy Mary Teegee, over to you.
Thank you. Best for last, winner. Buckle up, let's go. First of all, my name is Mary Teegee. I'm so honored to be here as chief proxy for an incredible chief, Chief Robert Michel from Stillatin. Denise Sekoze Skaize, Samolgit Simahanach, my wonderful leaders, colleagues, and of course, all of you for being here. I'm just so honored to be here. We would not be here, and I'm glad, you know, Chief Fiddler did mention this, we would not be here if it was not for Cindy Blackstock. Let's not forget where this started. One individual having the courage to stand up to Canada to end discrimination against our children by their discriminatory funding approach, Directive 20-1, that was based on population and not by need. This funding formula left agencies without funding to do the very important prevention work that we needed to do, and it also did not provide any nations with funding at all to prevent children being removed from their homes. We've come full circle because the final settlement agreement, the draft final settlement agreement, intends to do just that, is to remove the prevention funding from the agencies. This agreement has to be a yes and agreement. It cannot be divisive. Over 80% of our nations are being served by a designated agency. We cannot think that those children being served by those agencies, their lives matter any less. So we have to come together and make a good decision. In 2016, Canada was found to be discriminatory, and so they were ordered to end discrimination, make sure it never happens again, and to compensate its victims. We already have the compensation final settlement agreement, and let's take lessons learned from that process. First of all, it was the minds at the time thought $5 billion was going to be enough to compensate its victims, and even had some long-term reform. It indemnified Canada back to 91. That was not good enough for us. 20 billion. They came back with 20 billion. That was not good enough for us because our children deserved better. So what did we end up on? 23.4, an additional 3.4 better, because you know why? We did not accept the first offer because our children deserve better. And this is where we're at right now with the final settlement agreement. This is the first offer. We can do better. The process right now I think about is the process, unfortunately, with all due respect to the wonderful people that they're given their hearts. I know, like the lawyers, you know, Koo, Nan, and they've given their hearts to this work. Absolutely, kudos to you and acknowledgements. But right away, there was a there was direction provided to the AFN, and that was directed to the Chiefs Assembly, directed back in December, Resolution 40/2022, to say any final agreement, there would be no reduction in funding. It would be a reduction in funding, as you know, over the years. Again, when you look at the fine print, Canada is supposed to fund the First Nations National Advisory Committee to inform the final settlement agreement. Again, direction from the chiefs. That didn't occur. We haven't had a NAC meeting since 2024, since February 2024. Canada and AFN to provide chiefs with all available options and related supporting financial resources to ensure long-term reform and to uphold free, prior, and informed consent. That was not done. We didn't see the final settlement agreement until July 8th. So when we think about this, I read some of the preamble. One of the things that we always say is that there's regional differences throughout Canada. In fact, in the preamble of the final settlement agreement, it says, the reforms are designed to take into account the unique circumstances of each of First Nation, including their historical, cultural, and geographical needs and circumstances. Yet the funding proposed in the draft final settlement agreement is a one-size-fits-all, and you can check that out in paragraph 22. The funding is not guaranteed. It's population-based funding formula. And in fact, this is what the CHRT found was discriminatory, is this population-based funding, and that is not acceptable for us. We can do better. The negotiations process, again, fundamentally fails to respect First Nations' inherent rights, Aboriginal and treaty rights, and their rights under international human rights law. Canada has not fulfilled its obligation to consult and accommodate First Nations or to secure their prior, and informed consent regarding this draft agreement. And that's because within the agreement, it says the parties will speak publicly in favor of the FSA and make best efforts to procure the endorsement of the FSA by First Nations leadership by way of resolution. Again, how is that free, prior, and informed consent if the end result is already a foregone conclusion? We can do better, and I definitely know that we can because we've been at it. We need to have the best minds, the experts. I often say this, at a negotiating table, if you're negotiating forestry, would you not have foresters there? When we were negotiating this, there were no resident experts. NAC was not represented there. Not all the provinces were represented at that negotiating table, so we have to do better. I know that I've often heard, this is not for on and off reserve. It's not for off reserve. Well, we didn't even try to put it in there. It wasn't even tried to put in there. So in Jordan's principle right now, it's for on and off reserve. Why did they not think to take the definition of a Jordan's principle child who can receive can receive services under that and utilize that same definition in this draft final settlement agreement, so our children, regardless if they live off or on reserve, would not have to suffer discrimination? We haven't even tried that. We need a negotiations process that includes the voices of the grandma, the matriarchs, the children, the families in our communities, because we haven't done that yet. We have a wonderful NAC, we have an expert advisory that they need to be providing input into this. Right now, we have the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal as a backstop. There is no immediate rush. Regardless of what government gets in, the CHRT orders still abide. You still have to follow that. And that's Canada law. No sitting government can tie the hands of any succeeding government, except for this agreement. This agreement would get rid of the CHRT, and what it would do is the agreement would be subject to annual appropriation. So what do you think is going to happen if this Conservative government gets in? Do you think Poilievre is really going to abide by the whole agreement? And what has happened so far under this government? We've been at them over 30 times, taking them to court. Who here trusts Canada? Raise your hand if you trust Canada. So we're going to trust Canada that they're going to fulfill this agreement, which, by the way, is only 9 years. What's going to happen after 9 years? We have to do better. Our children deserve our best minds, our best research. Our children deserve to hear from the best elders, knowledge keepers, matriarchs. It has to be reflected in this agreement. To do anything less is a disservice to our children now and those not yet born. Masai, thank you.
Miigwech, Chimigwech. So, and thank you for all participants